Chapter 1. The Captain's Gambit. The scent of death clung to the wind. It whispered through the broken trees and the desolate countryside, carrying the stench of decay from the cursed ruins of Mordheim. The city lay ahead, a jagged black silhouette against the gray sky, its broken spires reaching toward the heavens like the fingers of a dying god. The very air around it felt wrong, too thick, too heavy, as though the land itself recoiled from the cancerous ruin. Captain Alric von Kessel sat atop his warhorse, a towering black destrier that pawed at the dirt, nostrils flaring. Even the beast could sense the unnatural aura of the city. The Crimson Roses, his band of hardened warriors, were assembled behind him, their faces half hidden by helmets and hoods, their armor dented and scarred from years of battle. They were killers, every one of them, veterans of border skirmishes, deserters from the Empire's wars, exiled knights, and worse. Alric, however, was no common sellsword. He had fought for Kislevite warlords, Bretonnian dukes, Thailand princes, always for coin, never for a cause. But Mordheim was different. He lifted the rolled parchment in his gloved hand, the edges cracked and brittle. His mysterious patron, a man whose name had never been spoken, whose face had never been seen, had provided it with a simple promise. Follow this map, and you will find a fortune beyond reckoning, wyrdstone enough to buy a kingdom. It was a fool's dream. But Alric had never been one to turn down fool's gold, not when it was stained red with the blood of lesser men. The warband of the Crimson Rose. The roses gathered as he dismounted. The group was as grim and varied as any warband foolish enough to venture into the city of the damned. Isolde the Red, his second-in-command, stood close, her sword resting against her shoulder. Tall and lean, her crimson hair was tied back, and her sharp blue eyes were filled with the cold fire of a killer. "I still say this is madness," she muttered. Father Wulfgar, once a warrior priest of Sigmar, now a half-mad zealot, clutched the great warhammer strapped to his back. His white robes were soiled, the sigil of the twin-tailed comet worn and faded. "Sigmar's light does not reach this place," he growled. "We walk into a den of devils, Captain." Greth the alchemist, small and hunched, fiddled with the iron vials strapped to his belt. His fingers, blackened from years of wyrdstone handling, twitched with excitement. "Fortune favors the bold, does it not?" he cackled. "The Empire pays for wyrdstone by the ounce. Imagine what we might haul from the ruins, enough to drown in riches." Jurgen the ox, a monstrous brute in battered plate armor, spat onto the ground. "Enough talk. We go, or we don't. But the longer we stand here, the more likely something is watching." Alric smirked. That was the beauty of it. Something was always watching in Mordheim. The city gates. They pressed forward. The ruined gates of Mordheim loomed ahead, iron-rusted, wood splintered, hanging open like the maw of some ancient beast. Beyond lay a graveyard of shattered buildings and blackened streets. Corpses, some recent, some old as dust, were strewn about, picked clean by carrion birds or worse. Sigmar's comet had left the city in ruins, but it had done far more than destroy mortar and stone. It had changed Mordheim. Alric felt it in his bones as they stepped beyond the gate, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressed against them, though the streets appeared empty. Shadows shifted unnaturally. Shapes flickered in the periphery of vision, gone when looked at directly. The wind carried whispers, unintelligible but insidious. "Keep your weapons loose," Alric ordered. Jurgen grunted. "They always are." They moved in formation, Alric and Isolde at the front, Greth hunched over his alchemical vials, Wulfgar clutching his hammer, whispering a prayer to Sigmar. The others followed, their steps muted on the cracked cobblestones. The first warning. It wasn't long before they found the first sign that they weren't alone. A corpse, impaled on an iron spike outside what had once been a merchant's house. The body was fresh, its face twisted in agony, its flesh stripped down to bloody muscle, ribs cracked open. "This wasn't a beast's work," Isolde murmured. Wulfgar stepped closer, peering at the gaping wound in the man's chest. He recoiled. This man's heart is missing. Ritual killing? Alric asked. Wulfgar nodded. Or worse. The corpse suddenly twitched. Isolde had her sword out in an instant, but the movement was nothing more than the play of the wind. The dead man's fingers, blackened and stiff, seemed to beckon them forward. No one spoke. A distant skittering sound echoed through the ruined alleys. Skaven, into the city. Move! Alric ordered. They hurried forward, pressing deeper into the ruins. The great library, their first destination, was marked on the map, a towering structure of collapsed stone and broken statues. If their patron's map was true, the first cache of wyrdstone lay beneath it. The streets closed in around them. Buildings leaned like dying men, their windows gaping like empty sockets. The deeper they went, the darker the world became. The sky, already overcast, seemed to dim, as though the city itself wished to snuff out the sun. Then they found it. A statue of Sigmar, once proud, now desecrated, its eyes gouged out, its face smeared with blood, strange runes carved into its chest. Around its base, bones lay in a circle, gnawed clean. Father Wulfgar's breath quickened. Chaos has taken this place. This is not a city of men. Alric said nothing. A single footstep echoed from the alley ahead. The warband whirled, weapons raised. Nothing, just empty darkness. Then another step. And another. From the shadows, something moved. Not quite human, not quite beast. The crimson roses had entered Mordheim. And Mordheim had noticed. Chapter 2. The Warband of the Crimson Rose. The twilight of Mordheim had barely settled when the members of the Crimson Roses gathered in a derelict courtyard, its cracked stone floor littered with remnants of past lives. Amid the dying light, Captain Alric von Kessel surveyed his assembled warband with a cold, calculating gaze. His eyes, scarred by countless battles, flickered with ambition as he recalled the promise of wyrdstone and fortune, a lure too potent to ignore. His leather armor, marked by fresh bloodstains and older scars alike, testified to a lifetime spent on the edge of chaos. Isolde the Red moved with a sinuous grace as she approached him, her sword catching the dim light with every deliberate step. Her reputation as a deadly duelist was well earned. The very air around her seemed to crackle with lethal intent. The deep scar running down one side of her face spoke of a duel fought in brutal honesty, a memory as vivid as the burning anger in her eyes. In a rare moment of quiet confidence, she murmured, "We tread paths soaked in treachery tonight, Captain. Let our blades sing our truth." Her voice was both a warning and a promise. Close by, Father Wulfgar knelt in a circle of half-burnt candles, his threadbare robes marked with the fading sigils of Sigmar. His voice, usually a booming herald of divine justice, now trembled with a mix of zeal and madness. "By Sigmar's mercy, we purge the filth of chaos," he intoned, raising his warhammer high. The hammer's metal face glistened with the remnants of previous sacrifices, chunks of bone and splintered flesh, each a grim reminder of his unyielding faith and the brutal justice he dispensed. In stark contrast, Greth the alchemist shuffled forward, his eyes wild beneath a mop of unkempt hair. His fingers danced nervously over a collection of vials and rusted apparatus, their contents bubbling with an eerie, phosphorescent glow. Greth's mind teetered on the brink of genius and insanity, a state born from countless nights spent deciphering the dark secrets of wyrdstone. "Each drop, each shard of the cursed stone. Imagine the power," he babbled, his voice rising with feverish excitement as he recounted experiments that had ended in explosions and gory mishaps. Towering behind them, Jurgen the Ox loomed like a living fortress. His massive frame was encased in battered plate armor that creaked with every labored step. With a permanent sneer carved onto his scarred face, Jurgen's hands gripped his axe, a monstrous blade stained by the carnage of his past. "Words are wasted on a battlefield," he grunted, recalling a recent brawl where he had ripped through foes with such merciless force that blood spattered like rain upon his armor. His tragic past was written in every bruise and every deep cut on his flesh, each a testament to his unquenchable thirst for revenge and glory. At the periphery of the group, the reckless brothers Hagen and Ludolf clashed with each other even as they waited for orders. Their youthful energy and unchecked bravado were a dangerous mix, a volatile cocktail that could ignite at any moment. Hagen, with eyes gleaming with reckless optimism, boasted of his next great feat, while Ludolf, his grin tinged with madness, brandished a dagger with an almost disturbing affection. The air around them vibrated with their fervor, their words echoing the promise of blood and the fleeting thrill of combat. In the murk of Mordheim's ruined courtyard, their voices blended into a cacophony of grim determination and barely contained aggression. Alric's commanding tone broke through the clamor. "Tonight we are more than mere mercenaries. Tonight we are the harbingers of our own destiny. Let no enemy, beast, or treacherous shadow stand in our way. We claim what is promised to us, even if that promise is soaked in the blood of our foes." As the warband prepared to set off into the labyrinthine depths of the accursed city, a sudden skittering noise from the darkened alley caught their attention. Without hesitation, Jurgen's axe roared to life, cleaving through a lurking creature that burst forth, a misshapen monstrosity with rotting fur and serrated teeth. The creature's body contorted grotesquely under the brutal assault, its entrails spewing out in a visceral fountain of gore. Hagen and Ludolf, fueled by a shared adrenaline rush, leaped into the fray, their blades slicing through the foul creature's flesh in tandem. Blood splattered across the ancient stones as the brothers engaged in a savage, short-lived skirmish. The creature's shrieks mixed with the clash of metal and the grunts of exertion, forming a grim symphony of violence that resonated with the warband's savage spirit. In that moment, every member of the Crimson Roses, whether driven by honor, madness, or a thirst for glory, embraced the brutal reality of their path. In Mordheim, there was only victory or death, and sometimes both in the same heartbeat. The echoes of combat faded into the oppressive silence of the ruined city, leaving the Crimson Roses standing amidst the carnage. With grim resolve etched into every line of their faces, they resumed their march into the haunted heart of Mordheim, each step heavy with the promise of further bloodshed and betrayal. Chapter 3: The City of the Damned. The gates of Mordheim loomed before them, splintered, scorched, and twisted with age. The iron portcullis had been shattered long ago, jagged teeth of rusted metal reaching upward like a broken jaw. Beyond it lay the corpse of a city, a ruin of twisted stone and rot, its skyline broken by crumbling towers and the skeletal remains of cathedrals blackened by flame. As Alric von Kessel led the Crimson Roses past the threshold, the stench hit them. A pungent wave of decay and filth, a mixture of rotting flesh, burned wood, and something worse. The air itself felt wrong, thick like curdled milk, pressing against their lungs as if the city was breathing with them. "Mordheim," Isolde muttered, resting her hand on the pommel of her rapier. "The City of the Damned." It lived up to its name. The ruins of empire. They stepped into the first district, where once merchants and nobles had bartered over silks and spices. Now the cobblestones were cracked and uneven, some sections entirely replaced by wriggling masses of green glowing stone, wyrdstone, the cursed remnants of Sigmar's comet. A horse carcass, half-rotted and swarmed with fat, writhing maggots, lay across the broken road. Something had torn it open from the inside, the ribs splintered outward like an iron cage. "That's not natural," Hagen muttered, tightening his grip on his axe. "Nothing here is," Father Wulfgar said grimly, gripping his warhammer. His knuckles were white beneath his gauntlets, his lips muttering a prayer to Sigmar. "This city was smote from the heavens. The only things left are the Forsaken." A distant wail echoed through the ruined streets. It didn't sound human. Alric raised a fist, signaling the warband to stop. He scanned the surrounding buildings, their windows gaping like empty eye sockets, their wooden beams collapsed into the skeletons of once proud structures. The great library, their destination, was still several streets ahead. "We move in formation," Alric ordered. "Stay sharp, we're not alone." The first encounter. As they pressed deeper into the ruins, the skittering began. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, sharp clawed feet scratching against stone, moving fast, moving just beyond sight. Shadows darted along the edges of the ruins, inhuman eyes glinting from the darkness. "Skaven." Wulfgar spat in disgust. "Filthy vermin. At least we know what we're dealing with." Jurgen, the ox, grunted, cracking his thick knuckles. "Would have been worse if it was something we couldn't see." As if in answer, a rusted throwing star hissed through the air. It clanged off Alric's pauldron, spinning into the dust. "Ambush!" Isolde shouted, her rapier flashing from its scabbard. From the ruins they came, leaping from the shadows with yellowed teeth bared. Skaven, filthy, plague-ridden rat-men, their beady red eyes glowing with hunger. Their tattered armor was cobbled together from scavenged metal and broken bones, their weapons crude but deadly. Wicked daggers, rusted swords, serrated spears. Greth the alchemist was already moving, hurling a glass vial into the fray. It shattered against the ground, a burst of green fire erupting as the Skaven screeched in agony, their flesh boiling from their bones. Jurgen waded forward, swinging his massive two-handed sword in a brutal arc. The first rat-man was cleaved in half, intestines spilling onto the ground in a steaming mess. The second tried to dart away. Jurgen grabbed it by the throat, lifted it, and slammed it against a crumbling wall so hard its skull shattered like an overripe fruit. Isolde moved like a dancer, her rapier a blur. 1, 2, 3 bodies fell around her, their throats slashed open, dark arterial blood spraying against the ruins. Alric fought beside her, his long sword slicing through fur and flesh, cutting a rat's ear from its head before driving his blade deep into another's chest, twisting for maximum damage. The Skaven shrieked and scattered, darting back into the ruins, vanishing as quickly as they had come. "Cowards!" Jurgen roared after them, blood dripping from his gauntlets. Alric cleaned his blade, his breath steady despite the carnage. They weren't done. This had been a test, a probing strike. "That was just a scouting party," Wulfgar said grimly. "The real swarm will come soon enough." The great library. They pressed on through the twisting streets, past burned-out manors, collapsed bell towers, and monuments defaced with blasphemous symbols. They passed bodies crucified on iron spikes, their guts wound around pillars, their flesh turned to waxen, shriveled husks. And then, at last, they reached their destination, the great library of Mordheim, or rather, what remained of it. The once grand structure had partially collapsed, its stone pillars split, its marble statues reduced to rubble. Books, scorched and rotting, littered the entrance, their pages fluttering in the wind like dying birds. The massive double doors had been ripped open, their brass hinges twisted and broken. Dark stains, blood stains, marked the threshold. Greth's hands twitched with excitement, his beady eyes flicking across the ruins. "If the wyrdstone cache is anywhere, it's beneath this place." Alric studied the open doors, his instincts screaming at him. "Something else is inside," he murmured. Isolde smirked, rolling her shoulders. "Then let's introduce ourselves." They stepped into the darkness of the great library, weapons drawn, and Mordheim welcomed them. Chapter 4. The Watchers in the Dark. The great library of Mordheim was a ruin of forgotten knowledge, its walls cracked, its grand pillars shattered by the comet's wrath. Darkness festered within, curling around the remains of once proud shelves, their wood rotting, their books gnawed by vermin. Sigils of forgotten scholars were defaced by crude symbols, twisting runes scratched deep into the stone, filled with dried blood and filth. The air stank of mildew, old parchment, and something more rancid. Alric von Kessel ran a gloved hand along a fallen column, his fingers coming away black with ash. "Do you feel it?" Father Wulfgar muttered, his breath fogging despite the warmth of the night. "This place is cursed." Alric didn't respond. He did feel it. A weight pressed down on him, like the air itself had thickened, pressing against his skull, his chest, his very thoughts. Mordheim's ruin wasn't just of brick and stone, it had rotted into something deeper, something unseen. They were not alone. The campfire and the uneasy silence. They set up camp in the remains of what had once been the library's great atrium, an open space where grand chandeliers had once hung, where students had once debated philosophy. Now cobwebs and rot adorned its skeletal remains. The campfire's glow flickered across the broken shelves, sending long, jagged shadows stretching across the ruin. Jurgen dug a pit, piling up stones and charred wood for reinforcement. Wulfgar etched a crude holy symbol into the dirt, muttering a prayer to Sigmar, his voice hoarse. "Superstitions won't save us," Isolde muttered, sharpening her rapier in quick, precise strokes. Wulfgar glared at her. "Neither will steal against what lurks in this place." The whispers begin. The first sound came from beyond the ruins, a skittering, barely audible beneath the wind. Then came the whispers. Low, almost imperceptible, like the wind rasping through broken stone. But it wasn't the wind. "Jackskrik. Fik. Man thinks die soon." The language was inhuman, a chittering of guttural sounds, spoken in quick, nervous bursts. Greth, hunched over his alchemical kit, barely looked up. "Skaven," he muttered. "They're watching us." "We knew they would," Aur said, gripping the hilt of his sword. "Let them watch." Greth's lips twisted into a grin. "Oh, but they're patient, Captain. They watch. They wait. They like it when their prey is tired, when their minds start to slip." He tapped his temple with a blackened finger, his eyes gleaming with something between intelligence and madness. "The wyrdstone does that. It speaks to them. It will speak to us, too. Soon enough." Jurgen growled. "Then we kill them before they get the chance." The figures in the shadows. As the fire burned lower, the warband felt it. The unseen eyes. Figures moving just beyond the fire's reach, darting between crumbled bookshelves and fallen pillars. Occasionally glimpses of movement, eyes catching the firelight, shapes hunched low, scurrying like roaches. Something giggled, high and shrill, from the rafters above. Hagen and Ludolf, the twin brothers, spun around. "What in the name of—" A small rock clattered across the stone floor, rolling to a stop at Alric's boot. "Playthings," Greth whispered. "They like to play first." The Skaven were testing them. Alric drew his sword, the rasp of steel echoing through the ruin. "Enough of this." Wulfgar raised his warhammer, voice steady. "They will come soon, they always do." The warband tightened their formation, the fire crackling between them, their backs pressed against fallen stone and broken bookshelves, eyes watching every shifting shadow. Then the whispers stopped. The skittering ceased. A silence heavier than death fell upon the ruins. Jurgen exhaled through his nose, flexing his gauntleted hands. "What's the matter?" he called into the dark. "Scared?" No response. Then, thump. A wet, meaty sound echoed from the upper floors of the library. And another. The sound of something heavy being dragged. The warband tensed, weapons drawn. Then something fell from the rafters, hitting the stone floor with a sickening splatter. A corpse. Or what was left of one. Skinless limbs half chewed, bones gnawed to the marrow, the chest cavity a gaping wound, ribs broken outward, as if something had burst free from the inside. Ludolf cursed and staggered back, gagging. Greth tilted his head, fascinated. Oh! A single hissing breath came from the darkness. Then the fire went out. The attack. The ruins exploded into chaos. Skaven poured from the darkness, chittering, snarling, their blades gleaming with poison. A javelin whistled through the air. Jurgen caught it mid-slice, snapped the shaft and plowed into the nearest ratman, his blade tearing through fur and flesh. Wulfgar bellowed a war hymn, swinging his warhammer in a brutal arc, caving in a Skaven's skull, its eyes bursting from the impact. Isolde moved like a wraith, her rapier flashing, finding gaps in armor, slipping between ribs, cutting throats before they could scream. Hagen and Ludolf fought side by side, twin axes splitting vermin in a dance of steel and blood, hacking limbs from bodies, severing tails, skulls, spines. Alric's blade bit deep, disemboweling one, kicking it into another as he turned to meet a second wave, his sword slicing through yellowed fangs and shrieking throats. Greth hurled vials of alchemical fire, green flames licking across the Skaven, their screeches turning into tortured howls as their flesh bubbled and peeled away. But the Skaven did not stop. They came in waves from every shadow, climbing over bodies uncaring of their dead. Alric cut down another, only for a fresh set of red eyes to gleam at him from the dark. There were too many. Then a deep, resonant horn blast echoed through the ruins. The Skaven froze, their ears twitching. Then, just as suddenly as they had attacked, they vanished. Skittering into the blackened corridors, melting into the ruins, retreating into the depths of Mordheim. Only the corpses remained, steaming in the cold air. Breathing hard, Alric scanned the battlefield. The warband was still standing, but bloodied, bruised, and shaken. The Skaven hadn't retreated out of fear. They had left for another reason. From the darkness, something else was watching, and it had just arrived. Chapter 5. Blood in the Streets. Mordheim had gone quiet again. The warband moved through the ruins, their boots crunching over shattered bones and blackened stone. The aftermath of the Skaven lingered in the air, the acrid scent of blood and burning fur, the coppery tang of death. The corpses of the ratmen were strewn about, some still twitching, others crumpled like discarded dolls. Yet the true horror was not what had happened, but what had not. The Skaven had retreated, not because they had been defeated, but because something worse was coming. The ambush. They emerged into the main thoroughfare of the ruined city, a once grand boulevard, now choked with rubble, collapsed spires, and the broken skeletons of carts and wagons. The sky above was a swirling gray mass, a storm that never seemed to break, casting an eerie half-light over the city. Ludolf wiped sweat and grime from his face, his grip tight on his twin axes. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Feels like we're being herded." "We are," Isolde said flatly. Her rapier dripped with rat blood, her sharp eyes scanning the rooftops, the alleys, the gaping wounds of doorways and the ruins around them. "They want us here." Alric nodded, rolling his shoulders. His sword, Requiem, felt heavier than usual. He knew what this was. A kill zone. "Stay sharp," he said. "They're coming." And then the screaming began. From the shattered remains of a chapel they came. Figures clad in crimson robes, their faces hidden behind iron masks carved with twisted symbols, their hands gripping jagged weapons of black steel. Chaos. The cabal of the shattered eye. Fanatics, mutants, killers in the name of the dark gods. The first of them rushed forward, howling praises to their dark masters. The street became a slaughterhouse. The battle begins. Jurgen met them first, his massive sword carving through the first robed figure, splitting muscle, bone, and sinew. The second cultist lunged, a rusted cleaver aimed for his throat. Jurgen caught the attack on his gauntlet, twisting the man's wrist until the bone snapped like brittle wood, before slamming him against a stone pillar so hard his skull burst like an overripe fruit. Hagen roared, his axe finding a throat, blood spraying like a fan across the broken cobbles. Isolde danced between them, her rapier striking like a serpent. One cultist gurgled as her blade slid under his chin. Another stumbled, clutching his belly, intestines spilling between his fingers. But the cultists did not die easily. They were not like men. One of them, his mask twisted into a leer, grabbed Wulfgar by the throat, his fingernails splitting into black talons. "You are all blessed," the thing gurgled, its voice warped and inhuman. "Your flesh will—" Wulfgar crushed its skull with a single blow of his warhammer, brain matter spattering across his robes. Greth moved at the edges of the battle, hurling vials of green fire. One shattered against a cultist's chest, his flesh melting as he shrieked. Another ignited a cluster of them, the acrid scent of burning meat filling the air. Alric parried a savage strike, drove his boot into a robed figure's gut, and in the same motion brought Requiem down in a brutal arc, severing an arm, then a head. For a moment it seemed as though they might hold. Then the second wave came, and Ludolf was the first to fall. The death of Ludolf. A hulking figure emerged from the ruins, its body distended and swollen, flesh fused with rusted armor plates, its veins pulsing with unholy light. In its hands was a two-handed flail, its spiked iron head glistening with blood. It swung with unnatural speed. Ludolf barely had time to react. He raised his axes in a desperate block, but the flail struck him square in the ribs. A sickening crunch echoed through the street. Ludolf was lifted off his feet. He hit the wall of a ruined building with a wet impact, his body crumpling. Hagen screamed in fury, rushing the beast, but the monster backhanded him aside, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Ludolf tried to rise, his mouth filling with blood. He looked up at Alric, eyes wide, almost apologetic. Then the flail came down again. The impact shattered his skull, spraying brain and bone across the cobbles. His body twitched once, then stilled. Ludolf was dead. The retreat. "Fall back," Alric bellowed. Hagen, wounded, was dragged up by Jurgen, his face twisted in agony. Isolde parried a strike, drove her sword into an opponent's eye, then turned to flee. Greth hurled his last vial, covering the retreat in a wall of alchemical fire. Wulfgar brought his warhammer down on a cultist's kneecap, shattering it, before spinning and running. The warband broke away, sprinting through the ruined streets, the enemy hot on their heels. The battle had turned into a rout. The aftermath. When they finally stopped, breath ragged, bodies battered, the realization sank in. Ludolf was gone. Hagen sat against a broken pillar, blood leaking from a deep cut along his ribs. Jurgen stood over him, expression unreadable, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles went white. Greth muttered to himself, a manic gleam in his eye. Isolde sat against a half-collapsed wall, wiping blood from her rapier, staring blankly ahead. Wulfgar knelt in prayer, his warhammer resting against his chest. Alric stood, staring into the darkness, his expression cold, hard. The wyrdstone was still out there. But at what cost? Was this fortune worth it? Would any of them leave this city alive? The silence stretched. Then the whispering began again. From the darkness, from the ruins, from something that had been watching them all along. Mordheim was not finished with them yet. Chapter 6. Whispers of the Damned. The air was heavy with the scent of burned flesh, blood, and decay. The ruins of Mordheim loomed over them like the ribs of a vast, rotting beast, the broken buildings hunched in eternal collapse. The warband sat in grim silence, their campfire flickering in the shadow of a fallen monument to Sigmar, its statue defiled, its stone face gouged out, leaving only empty sockets staring into the abyss. Ludolf was dead. Jurgen lay on the ground, his side bandaged but bleeding through. Jurgen sat beside him, sharpening his sword with slow, deliberate strokes, his expression unreadable. Greth muttered to himself, hunched over a small pile of wyrdstone fragments, fingers twitching. And Wulfgar was praying, or listening. The first vision. The warhammer rested across Wulfgar's lap, its once gleaming sigil of Sigmar now stained with blood and dirt. His lips moved in whispered prayer, but his thoughts were elsewhere, floating, drifting, somewhere between waking and dreaming. The ruins around him seemed to blur, the firelight flickering in unnatural colors, reds, greens, sickly yellows that did not belong. The world grew distant, as if he had stepped between realms. Then came the voice. Wulfgar. The priest froze, his breath catching in his throat. Wulfgar, my faithful son. It was deep, resounding like a hammer striking an anvil, but soft as dying embers. It was Sigmar, wasn't it? The darkness peeled away, and he saw. A city of gold and light, shining beneath a sky of radiant fire. Temples of Sigmar stood unbroken, their bells ringing in celestial harmony. The dead stood, whole again, their bodies wrapped in the divine glow of salvation. And at the center of it all a great figure stood, wreathed in light, holding a hammer so vast it could shatter mountains. My son, my warrior, the path before you is righteous. The path before you is fire. Cleanse the unholy, strike down the impure. The city is a wound upon the world, and you are my blade. Tears welled in Wulfgar's eyes. Burn it all. The awakening. He gasped, wrenching himself free from the vision, hands gripping his warhammer like a drowning man clutching driftwood. The golden city was gone. He was back in Mordheim, where the only light came from the fire flickering low and the ruins breathed with unseen life. Are you well? Wulfgar snapped his head up. Isolde stood over him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but her stance tense. Wulfgar swallowed, his throat dry as dust. I was given a vision. A true vision. She raised an eyebrow. A vision? From Sigmar? Wulfgar nodded, his hands trembling with fervor. He has commanded me. We must cleanse this place in fire. We must destroy the wyrdstone, burn every trace of corruption. Greth snorted, not even looking up from his wyrdstone fragments. That's convenient. The stuff is worth a king's ransom, and you want to turn it into ash. It is poison, Wulfgar snapped, surging to his feet. Sigmar showed me. It warps flesh, mind, and soul. It is the root of this city's curse. Greth chuckled, tossing a shard into the air and catching it. Or maybe the city's just crawling under your skin, priest? The argument. Enough, Alric said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the camp like a blade. The warband turned toward him. We need to decide, are we pressing on or are we leaving? A silence stretched. Isolde took a step forward, her hand on her hip. Leaving, she said simply. We've lost Ludolf. Hagen's wounded. If we keep going, we're all going to die. Alric's gaze hardened. You knew the risks when you signed on. Risks. Isolde's laugh was bitter. We walked into a goddamned meat grinder. Skaven, chaos cults, and whatever the hell else is lurking out there. This isn't a war, Alric. It's a death sentence. Wulfgar's voice was iron. Sigmar commands we stay. To abandon this cause is heresy. Isolde scoffed. Of course the fanatic wants to stay. Did Sigmar tell you to slit our throats while we sleep too? That's where this is headed, isn't it? The accusation hung in the air. Wulfgar stiffened. His fingers clenched his warhammer, his knuckles white. Jurgen, silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was low, rumbling. Ludolf didn't deserve to die for this, he said, his words slow, deliberate. None of us do. Ulric's jaw tightened. He felt it now, The warband was breaking, the fear and exhaustion gnawing at them like rats in the dark. A choice had to be made. And then a sound. Low. Wet. A gurgling noise, like a man trying to scream with his lungs full of blood. Hagen, sitting against the wall, suddenly stiffened. His eyes rolled back. His body convulsed. Then his mouth opened, too wide, jaw distending unnaturally, and a voice that was not his own rasped out, "You should have left, you should have left, you should have left." The warband froze. Hagen lurched forward, vomiting black bile onto the ground, his entire body jerking like a puppet on frayed strings. His hands clawed at his throat, his veins blackening beneath his skin, his body thrashing violently. Hagen, Jurgen roared, dropping to his knees, trying to hold his brother down. Hagen screamed, or something did, a high, inhuman shriek, his eyes bulging from their sockets. His fingernails split, blood pouring from his hands, his skin tearing open in places as something moved beneath it. Then, with one final spasm, he collapsed, twitching violently. And then he was still. The silence was deafening. Wulfgar slowly approached. Kneeling beside Hagen's corpse, he pressed 2 fingers to his throat. No pulse. He closed his eyes, muttering a prayer for the dead. Greth let out a shaky breath, staring at the body. "The city's playing tricks, eh? Still think it's just in our heads?" Alric turned to Wulfgar. "Your god still telling you to stay?" The priest's hands trembled. His faith was absolute, unquestioning. And yet, somewhere deep within, a splinter of doubt took root. Something was speaking to him in this city. But was it Sigmar? Or something else? End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Labyrinth Beneath. The Descent into Darkness. The entrance to the catacombs of Mordheim yawned before them like the throat of some ancient beast, the stone archway slick with moisture and blackened with age. The stairs leading downward were worn and uneven, smoothed by centuries of use, yet jagged where the very earth had split and cracked from the comet's impact. The air stank of rot, damp stone, and something more insidious, a metallic tang that clung to the tongue, as if the walls themselves were bleeding. Alric von Kessel led the way, his sword drawn, the torch in his other hand flickering uncertainly against the crushing darkness. The warband followed in silence, their boots echoing hollowly as they moved deeper into the bowels of the ruined city. Behind him, Greth let out a low, reverent murmur. "Listen," the alchemist whispered, almost breathless. "It's singing." Alric stiffened. "What?" Greth smiled, eyes glinting unnaturally in the dim light. "The wyrdstone," he said, gesturing to the crumbling walls. "It hums. Listen closely. It knows we are here." The others exchanged uneasy glances. "Enough of your damn nonsense," Jurgen grunted. "It's just stone, nothing more." But as they pressed on, they began to hear it too. Not a sound, exactly, but a sensation. A pressure against the skull, a vibration in the bones, as if something vast and unseen was murmuring just out of reach, whispering secrets in a language no mortal was ever meant to understand. The catacombs did not welcome them. They swallowed them whole. The winding paths of the dead. The passageway soon gave way to a vast, open chamber, where ancient tombs lined the walls, their lids cracked or missing. The dead had been disturbed long ago. Bones littered the ground, some old and brittle, some fresh and gnawed to splinters. Strange runes had been carved into the stone, flickering green in the torchlight, their meaning lost to time. "This place is a tomb," Isolde muttered, glancing around. "Why would wyrdstone be here?" "Because this is where it grows," Greth whispered, crouching beside one of the broken tombs. He ran his fingers along the stone, where veins of green wyrdstone pulsed like diseased arteries, twisting and writhing as if alive. He sighed, almost in pleasure. "Beautiful. Nothing about this place is beautiful, Wulfgar growled, his grip tightening on his warhammer. The priest hated this place. He could feel it seeping into his soul, burrowing into his thoughts like a parasite. The visions had not stopped since they entered the tunnels. Shadows flickering at the edge of his vision, voices whispering his name from empty crypts, laughter echoing from nowhere. "Sigmar guide us," he muttered under his breath. Something answered him. Does he, or does he watch and laugh? Wulfgar froze, his breath catching. The voice had come from inside his own skull, slithering through his thoughts like an oily serpent. "You were abandoned here, left to die, but I see you. I offer you more." He clenched his jaw, gripping the hammer tighter. "Lies." The voice chuckled. "Do you think the others will live long enough for you to prove that?" The echoes of the lost. The warband moved deeper. The catacombs twisted and turned, the pathways narrowing in places, forcing them to squeeze between jagged stone, their armor scraping against the walls. Fetid water dripped from the ceiling, pooling beneath their feet, turning the ground slick and treacherous. Then they began to hear the voices. Soft at first, like a distant wind. Then clearer. Crying, begging. A chorus of whispers, some frantic, others guttural and inhuman. "Please, please don't leave me here. Flesh for the masters. Flesh for the dark. Run, run before they find you." Hagen shuddered. They sound real. "They were real," Greth murmured, grinning. "Once." A child's voice giggled from the shadows. Isolde spun, her rapier raised. Nothing, just the tombs. And then a wet, slithering sound echoed from ahead. Something was moving in the dark. The thing beneath the city. Alric raised a fist, signaling the warband to stop. The slithering grew louder. Close. A low, gurgling moan came from the next chamber. Alric took a slow step forward, raising the torch high. The flickering light revealed a mass of bodies, twisted, writhing, fused together into a nightmare of rotting flesh and wyrdstone. Human torsos melted into one another, their faces contorted in agony, their arms twitching like the legs of an insect. Eyes, dozens of them, blinked in the darkness, scattered across the abomination's shifting flesh, some weeping black ichor, others bulging grotesquely. It moaned again, its many mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Then it lunged. The battle in the dark. The abomination moved faster than it had any right to, pulling itself forward with clawed hands, its bodies twisting unnaturally. Jurgen charged, his greatsword swinging down in a brutal arc. It sank into flesh, but the creature barely noticed, its wounds closing almost instantly as new mouths split open along its bloated skin. It swiped at him, raking deep gashes across his chest. He staggered back, gasping, blood spilling between his fingers. Greth hurled a vial of alchemical fire, and the flames erupted across the creature's body. It shrieked, the sound splitting the air like 1,000 voices screaming at once, but it did not stop. Instead it grew. The flames did not burn it. They fed it. The wyrdstone embedded in its flesh glowed brighter, its veins pulsing green. "That's impossible," Greth breathed. "Fall back," Alric roared. The warband staggered away, hacking and slashing as the creature pulled itself through the tunnel, its many hands reaching, its eyes burning with unnatural hunger. Wulfgar raised his warhammer, screaming a prayer to Sigmar, and brought it down onto the nearest head. The skull caved in, flesh splattering across the ground. For a moment the thing stopped. Then its mouths opened in unison. "We see you." Then the walls of the tunnel began to move. They weren't in a catacomb. They were in something else. Something alive. Mordheim was swallowing them whole. Chapter 8. The Thing in the Dark. The walls pulsed, slick with moisture, the very stone quivering like living flesh. The warband staggered backward, weapons drawn, their breathing ragged as the tunnel narrowed around them, shifting, twisting, closing in. "We see?" The words did not come from a single voice. They slithered through the air, overlapping, whispering from every shadow, from the very stone itself. And then the thing came crawling out of the darkness. A glimpse of horror. At first it was just movement, a shifting mass in the gloom beyond the torchlight. Then came the sound, wet, dragging, like something pulling itself forward on ruined limbs. The torchlight caught it. It had once been a man. At least, it had once had the shape of a man. Now its flesh had become something else entirely. Pale, glistening muscle bulged obscenely, stretched too tight over a twisted frame, bones jutting through in sickening angles. Its arms had fused together at the elbow, forming a grotesque clawed appendage, and wyrdstone shards jutted from its body like parasitic growths, their sickly green light illuminating the ruin of its face. Eyes, too many eyes, bulged from its cheeks, its forehead, its throat, all blinking independently. Its mouth had split apart, forming a gaping, jagged maw, its teeth warped into black, chitinous spikes. And worst of all, it spoke. "Flesh, I remember." Flesh. The voice was wrong, wet, choking on itself, words breaking apart like shattered bones. Greth let out a breathless laugh, almost giddy. "By the gods, look at it! Look at what the wyrdstone does!" "Shut your damn mouth," Isolde hissed. The thing took another step forward, its twisted hands flexing, nails splitting like cracked glass, black ichor dripping from between its fingers. Then it lunged. The battle in the tunnels. The warband exploded into motion. Jurgen met it first, his massive two-handed sword flashing in the darkness, the blade carved deep into the abomination's chest, splitting muscle and bone, but it didn't slow. The creature swung its malformed limb, catching Jurgen across the ribs. Bone cracked, and the giant mercenary was sent hurtling into the wall, dust and shattered stone raining down around him. Alric lunged in, requiem carving a deep gash across its exposed spine. Black bile sprayed, sizzling against the stone, but the thing barely reacted. It turned its many eyes toward him. "I remember you." A spasming limb lashed out. Alric barely dodged in time, the clawed appendage raking the air where his head had been moments before. "Fall back," he roared. Greth hurled a vial, glass shattering against the creature's shoulder. Flames erupted, licking across the wyrdstone embedded in its flesh. For a moment it screamed, a horrible, warbling sound, like a choir of dying voices layered atop one another. Then the fire dimmed, snuffing out as if devoured by the stone itself. Greth cursed. No, it's feeding on it. The thing lashed out again, its elongated fingers piercing into Ludolf's corpse, still lying where he had fallen. And then, before their horrified eyes, it absorbed him. The dead man's flesh twisted, his bones snapping as they were pulled into the abomination's mass, his mouth opening in a silent scream as he was consumed into its writhing body. Jurgen staggered upright, bleeding from his side, watching it devour his brother's remains. His expression hardened. He knew they couldn't kill this thing, but he could hold it off. Jurgen's last stand. He turned to Alric, his massive frame hunched from pain but still standing like a fortress of muscle and iron. "Take them and go," he growled. Alric's eyes widened. "Jurgen, now." The abomination lunged again. Jurgen threw himself forward, his greatsword swinging in a desperate, brutal arc, burying itself into the creature's shoulder. It shrieked, thrashing violently, raking jagged nails across his side, tearing deep gouges into his flesh. Blood poured from the wounds, but Jurgen held firm, planting his feet, forcing it back with sheer strength. "Go," he bellowed. Alric hesitated for only a moment, then grabbed Isolde's arm and dragged her away. The warband turned and ran, sprinting down the winding tunnels, their torches casting frantic shadows. Behind them they heard Jurgen's roar of defiance, his sword slamming into the abomination again and again, the wet sound of flesh tearing, the horrible gurgling shriek of the monster. Then, a final, sickening crunch. In silence, the escape. The warband staggered into a side tunnel, their chests heaving, sweat and blood mixing with the filth of the catacombs. No one spoke. Jurgen was gone. Wulfgar dropped to his knees, hands clutching his warhammer, his voice breaking into a ragged prayer. Greth let out a weak, breathless laugh, half hysterical. "Oh, Jurgen, you mad bastard. You." Isolde punched him in the face. Greth hit the ground, blood trickling from his split lip, but he only laughed harder. Alric wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands shaking. They had lost 2 men. They had come for wealth, but only found death. And yet, the map still pointed deeper, through the tunnels, into the heart of Mordheim's darkness. And there was no turning back now. Chapter 9. Betrayal in the Ashes. The warband moved in silence. The tunnels twisted around them, ancient stone walls slick with moisture and filth, the air stagnant with decay. The only light came from their flickering torches, their glow barely piercing the endless gloom. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped, the sound hollow and distant, swallowed by the deep belly of Mordheim. Jurgen was gone. Ludolf was gone. And the warband was breaking. Fractured trust. Alric led the way, his sword drawn, but his mind clouded. The weight of the dead pressed down on him, their absence a wound that would not close. Jurgen had held the line, had given them a chance to escape, and now they stumbled forward like blind men, uncertain of their path. Behind him, Isolde walked with a clenched jaw, her body tense, her rapier still dripping with blackened blood. Wulfgar muttered a prayer under his breath, his eyes haunted, his grip white-knuckled on his warhammer. And then there was Greth. The alchemist had not spoken since the escape, but his hands twitched, his eyes darting through the shadows like a rat searching for an exit. Sweat clung to his brow, and his movements were frantic, restless. Alric noticed. Greth was hiding something? The price of greed. The wyrdstone veins in the walls throbbed. Sickly green light pulsed beneath the stone, spreading like cancer, illuminating Greth's gaunt, twitching face as they moved deeper into the catacombs. Finally, Alric had enough. He grabbed Greth by the collar, slamming him against the tunnel wall. The alchemist let out a startled gasp, his eyes going wide. "Talk," Alric growled. Greth licked his cracked lips, his hands twitching at his belt where small vials of wyrdstone dust clinked together. I don't know what you mean," he stammered. Isolde stepped closer, her rapier's tip pressing against his gut. "Don't lie to me, Gretha." Wulfgar loomed beside them, his voice heavy with disgust. "Sigma's light reveals all corruption." Greth chuckled, breathless and manic. Oh, does it?" he whispered. Then he lunged. With unnatural speed, he wrenched a vial from his belt and smashed it onto the ground. A burst of green mist erupted, choking, blinding. Alric cursed, stumbling backward. The tunnel exploded into motion. Shapes moved in the dark. Skittering, chittering, blades flashing in the torchlight. Skaven. It was a trap. The backstabber's reward. The first dagger struck Wulfgar, piercing through his shoulder. He roared in pain, swinging his hammer blindly, sending a ratman crashing against the tunnel wall, its skull splitting on impact. Alric threw himself to the side, narrowly dodging a rusted blade aimed at his throat. He caught a glimpse of Greth darting through the melee, vanishing into the darkness. "Greth, you bastard!" Isolde shouted, slashing her rapier across a Skane's belly, spilling its black guts onto the stone floor. The Skaven assassins poured from the tunnels, their red eyes gleaming, their blades coated in green venom. Shrouded in tattered cloaks, their movements were unnaturally fast, their chittering voices overlapping in cruel laughter. One of them leapt at Alric. Its jagged knife aimed for his ribs. He caught its wrist, twisting hard until he heard the bones snap, then drove requiem into its throat, black blood spraying hot against his armor. But there were too many. They had walked straight into an ambush. The fight in the dark. Wulfgar, bleeding heavily, swung his warhammer into another Skaven, crushing its spine with a sickening crunch. But the blow left him open. Another Ratman lunged, its blade tearing a deep gouge across his side. The priest stumbled, his hammer slipping from his grasp, his vision blurring from blood loss. Isolde was everywhere at once, her rapier a silver blur, finding the gaps between fur and armor, cutting deep, lethal thrusts. But for every Skaven that fell, 2 more took its place. Alric gritted his teeth, blocking another strike, then slashing downward through a Ratman's collarbone, nearly splitting it in half. "We need to move," he barked. Isolde spun, slicing through a Skaven's tendons, sending it crumpling to the floor. "And where exactly do you suggest, Captain?" There was only one way left. Down. The chase through the depths. Alric grabbed Wulfgar, throwing the wounded priest's arm over his shoulder. Ren. The warband bolted, leaving the dead and dying Skaven behind, sprinting deeper into the tunnels, their torches casting frantic shadows against the stone. The Skaven howled behind them, their shrieks bouncing off the walls, their claws scraping against the tunnel floors as they gave chase. Ahead, the passage narrowed, opening into a flooded corridor, half submerged in rancid water. Alric didn't hesitate. He plunged forward, dragging Wulfgar with him, the others following close behind. The water was freezing, thick with filth, the weight of it slowing them down. From behind, the Skaven assassins shrieked, their clawed feet splashing into the water, still gaining on them. Then, a shadow darted ahead of them. A figure stood at the far end of the tunnel, watching them with fever-bright eyes. Greth. His hands were coated in wyrdstone dust, his fingers twitching, his face twisted in a manic grin. Alric stared in disbelief. "Greth," he snarled. "You bloody traitor." The alchemist only laughed. "You don't see it, do you?" Greth whispered. His voice was not entirely his own anymore, as if something else was speaking through him. He lifted a vial, shaking it. "You were always small-minded, Alric," Greth continued, his grin widening unnaturally. "Always thinking about gold and steel, never power, never the truth." And then he hurled the vial at the tunnel's ceiling. There was a hiss, then a deafening crack. The stone above them split, and the tunnel collapsed. Alric had only a second to react. "Get back." The ceiling gave way, a tidal wave of rubble and stone crashing down. The last thing they saw was Greth's silhouette disappearing into the dark, his cackling laughter swallowed by the collapsing tunnel. Then everything went black. Chapter 10. A Lover's Lie. Buried alive. Everything was dark. The world was stone and dust and choking silence. For a long moment, Alric von Kessel thought he was dead, buried beneath the ruins of Mordheim, entombed alongside the thousands of lost souls who had perished here before him. Then came the pain, sharp and grinding, radiating from his ribs, where chunks of stone pinned him to the earth. His breath came in ragged gasps, dust clogging his throat. Somewhere nearby he heard the soft groan of shifting rubble, the trickle of loose stones settling, and then a voice. Alric. He tried to turn his head. A figure moved in the gloom beside him, her face half lit by the flickering remains of their torch. Isolde. She was bloodied, her arm bent at an odd angle, her hair caked in dirt and sweat. But she was alive. "You still breathing?" she rasped. Alric coughed, tasting copper. "Barely. "You're lucky," she said, managing a weak smirk. "I was about to claim your share of the treasure." There was no humor in her voice, because they both knew the truth. There was no treasure. There was only death. The lie between them. For a long time neither of them spoke. Beyond the ruined ceiling, Mordheim's faint green glow seeped through the cracks, casting jagged shadows across their prison of fallen stone. The Skaven were gone. Or perhaps they were just waiting. Alric shifted, trying to push himself free, but a sharp pain flared through his ribs. He gritted his teeth. "Damn it." "Don't move," Isolde warned. "You'll make it worse." Alric exhaled, feeling the exhaustion settling into his bones. He studied Isolde's face, bruised, tired, but still beautiful, even in this god's-forsaken place. "Why did you come here, Isolde?" She flinched, her gaze shifting away. "Same reason as you," she said lightly. "Glory, gold, wyrdstone to sell, the usual nonsense." "Liar," Alric murmured. Isolde's fingers tightened against the dirt. Then, after a moment, she let out a slow breath. "I never believed in the treasure," she admitted. Her voice was quieter now, the hardness peeling away, revealing something raw underneath. Alric felt his stomach tighten. "Then why?" She laughed softly, but there was no mirth in it. "Because of you, you idiot." His heart stumbled in his chest. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't mocking him. For the first time since he had met her, Isolde looked afraid. Afraid that she had said too much. Afraid of what came next. What could have been. Alric closed his eyes, his head resting back against the stone. His mind felt clouded, but for the first time, it wasn't from wyrdstone or exhaustion. It was her. "You should have stayed in Marienburg," he muttered. Isolde let out a breath, tilting her head toward him. "And what? Died in a duel for a handful of gold?" "You wouldn't have followed me here if you had a choice," Alric said. "You could have taken any contract, gone anywhere." She sighed. "You know me better than that." Alric did know. He thought about what could have been. If they had met anywhere else, on a battlefield, in a tavern in Altdorf, in the dueling rings of Marienburg, they could have left it all behind. But they hadn't. They were in Mordheim, and Mordheim took everything. She looked at him, eyes dark with something unspoken. "I wanted to believe in you, Alric. That's why I came." Alric swallowed, and then she looked away. "And now look at us." Neither of them had an answer. The prophet of Mordheim. A low muttering broke the silence. Alric and Isolde both turned toward the far end of the rubble-strewn chamber. Wulfgar was kneeling in the darkness, his hands pressed against his warhammer, his head bowed in fevered prayer. His voice was hoarse, whispering in a language neither of them recognized. Alric's skin prickled. "Wulfgar?" The priest did not look up. "The time has come," he whispered. Isolde glanced at Alric, uneasy. "What are you talking about?" Wulfgar's fingers traced the hammer's sigil, his breath ragged, his eyes wide and feverish. "Sigmar has spoken to me," he said, his voice filled with something unbreakable. "He has chosen me for a holy purpose." Alric felt something cold settle in his gut. "And what purpose is that?" Wulfgar finally raised his gaze, and Alric felt a sick jolt of dread. The priest's pupils were gone, his eyes white as polished bone, his face drawn and gaunt, as if something had hollowed him out from the inside. "The cleansing of Mordheim," Wulfgar murmured. He stood, his hammer clutched tightly, his hands trembling with righteous fervor. "We must burn it all." Alric gritted his teeth. "And what does that mean for us?" Wulfgar's lips twitched into a smile. "You will all burn with it." Isolde's hand dropped to her rapier. Alric felt his pulse thunder in his ears. The Wulfgar they had known was gone, and whatever had taken his place was not their ally anymore. Chapter 11. The Cathedral of Bones. the ascent to madness. The tunnels spat them out onto the ruins of a once grand courtyard, its cobblestones split by creeping vines, the remains of shattered columns rising like broken ribs from the earth. Above them, the corpse of a cathedral loomed, its spires twisted and blackened, its facade gouged by centuries of ruin. The Cathedral of Sigmar the Redeemer had once been a beacon of light. Now it was a grave for the faithful. Wulfgar led the way, his footsteps unwavering, his white eyes gleaming in the dim light of Mordheim's sky. "Sigmar speaks," he whispered. "He calls us here. This is where judgment will fall." Alric followed, but his hand rested on his sword's hilt, his jaw clenched with unease. Wulfgar had changed. Since their escape from the collapsed tunnels, the priest had become something else. He spoke less but muttered constantly, his fingers twitching over the grip of his warhammer, his breath hitching as if some unseen force whispered into his ear. Isolde walked beside Alric, her rapier drawn, her sharp eyes flicking between Wulfgar and the cathedral ahead. "I don't like this," she murmured. "He's losing himself." Ulrich nodded, his grip tightening. "I know." But it didn't matter. There was nowhere else to go. They had followed Wulfgar this far. Now they would see where his madness led them. The cathedral doors. The warband reached the grand entrance, its massive oak doors reinforced with iron, their surface scarred with deep gouges as though something had tried to tear its way inside. The statues of Sigmar that once stood watch were toppled, their faces smashed beyond recognition, their bodies gnawed by time and decay. And yet the doors themselves were intact, untouched. It was unnatural. "Words don't corrupt everything in this city," Greth had once said. "Nothing is left untouched, nothing is sacred." And yet this place had endured. It should not have. Alric and Isolde exchanged a glance. "Well?" she asked. Alric exhaled sharply and pushed the doors open. The Cathedral of Bones. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of rot. Their footsteps echoed through the gargantuan nave, where once rows of golden candlesticks and polished pews had lined the holy ground. Now those same pews were splintered and upturned, bones piled high between them, their surfaces polished clean by time and scavengers. The entire cathedral floor was littered with remains. Hundreds, thousands. It was as if an entire congregation had been slaughtered here, their bodies left to crumble into dust. And yet the altar remained pristine, untouched, and upon it stood a single reliquary. A glass-encased artifact resting on a pedestal of untarnished gold. It gleamed in the dim light, as though time itself refused to touch it. Wulfgar fell to his knees, his breath hitching in rapture. "The relic of St. Albreth," he whispered. "It has been preserved. The purity remains." Alric frowned. He had seen relics before. Saintly remains, Sigmarite artifacts, holy texts. None of them had ever felt this wrong. The whispering relic. The reliquary was small, the size of a man's head, its surface adorned with filigree, the image of Sigmar's hammer engraved into the silver frame. Within the glass case, resting on a velvet cushion, was a single, withered hand, the mummified remains of St. Albreth. Ulrich could hear it. A low hum, barely a whisper, almost like the lingering echo of a heartbeat, vibrating just beneath the skin of the world. Isolde took a step back, her expression twisted in unease. "It's whispering," she muttered. Alaric nodded. He could feel the weight of it, as though something unseen was pushing against the inside of his skull. "Something is wrong," he murmured. Wulfgar's head snapped toward him, his white eyes burning with anger. "You doubt Sigmar's light," he snarled. Alric turned toward him, his unease growing. "This place should be dust," he said. "The wyrdstone corrupts everything it touches, and yet this relic has remained, untouched, pure." How? Wulfgar's lips curled back in something between a snarl and a sneer. Because it is holy. Alric shook his head. Or it's something else entirely. The holy lies. Wulfgar stood, his warhammer gripped so tightly his knuckles cracked. You would question Sigmar's will, he hissed. Alric met his gaze, his voice low, steady. I question yours. Wulfgar twitched, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The madness that had been gnawing at the edges of his mind now burned in full force, his muscles trembling with zealotry and rage. You do not understand, he whispered. You never have. You never believed. He turned, his white eyes narrowing on Isolde. Nor did she, he murmured. Alric stepped between them, his sword inching free of its scabbard. Enough. Wulfgar's eyes flicked to the blade, and he smiled. Sigmar has spoken, he murmured, and I am his chosen. The first blow. The hammer swung faster than Alric expected. He barely dodged, the stone floor splintering where Wulfgar's weapon struck, sending shards of rock flying. Are you mad? Isolde shouted, stepping back. I am enlightened, Wulfgar bellowed, his voice shaking the cathedral walls. Alric raised his sword, his breath coming fast. Stand down, Wulfgar. The priest laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber like a madman's hymn. I have seen the truth. The city must be cleansed in fire and blood. His eyes glowed brighter, and the reliquary began to shake, as though something within it was trying to escape. Alric steeled himself. There was no coming back from this. Wulfgar had fallen too far, and the only way forward was through him. Chapter 12. The Map's Deception. The Burning of Faith. The cathedral reeked of madness and death. The air was thick with dust and the bitter scent of blood, the whispering relic of St. Albric pulsing with an unseen, malevolent force. The bones of the long-dead stared sightlessly from the shattered pews, their final congregation forever frozen in decay. And Wulfgar stood among them, his white eyes burning with unholy zeal, his warhammer raised as he moved to strike again. Alric barely dodged, the hammer slamming into the stone floor, sending shards of marble flying. Wulfgar was strong, unnaturally so, his movements driven by something more than mere muscle. He had lost himself. Or, worse, something else had found him. You are blind, Wulfgar spat, his breath ragged. Sigmar chose me to cleanse this place. You would stand in my way? Alric gritted his teeth, raising his sword. I stand against madmen. Then you stand against the light, Wulfgar snarled. He lunged again, hammer swinging in a brutal arc. Alric sidestepped, blade flashing, catching the priest across the ribs. The wound barely slowed him. Then Isolde struck. Her rapier darted in, finding the gap beneath Wulfgar's arm, sliding deep into flesh. Wulfgar let out a horrible gasp, stumbling back. But he did not fall. Instead, he laughed. A sick, rasping sound that echoed through the cathedral, bouncing off the bones of the dead. You cannot kill me, he whispered. Sigmar's light. Then his body seized, his breath hitching, his fingers clawing at his own skin. His veins bulged black, pulsing beneath his flesh. His eyes rolled back. And then, with a horrible snap, his body collapsed into a heap on the floor. Silence. Alric exhaled, stepping forward, nudging the priest's motionless form with the tip of his boot. Wulfgar did not move. It was over, or so they thought. The Return of Greth. A low, wet sound echoed from the shattered doorway. A chuckle. No, a gurgling laugh. Alric and Isolde spun, weapons raised. And there, standing in the broken archway of the cathedral, was Greth. Or rather, what had once been Greth. His flesh had warped, stretched too thin over jagged bones, his once gaunt frame twisting unnaturally. His skin had turned gray and slick, wyrdstone shards bursting from his shoulders and arms like tumors, their sickly green glow pulsing with an unholy rhythm. His face was the worst of it. His eyes had melted, replaced by sunken pits of light, his mouth split wider, his teeth sharpened into needled points, as if his own body had been reshaped for some new alien purpose. And he was smiling. "By the gods," Isolde whispered. Greth laughed again, his voice wet, slurred, as though his tongue had grown too large for his mouth. "Ah, my dear friends," he rasped, his two long fingers twitching, nails blackened and curling like claws. "You finally see it, don't you?" Alric stepped forward, blade raised. "What happened to you, Greth?" Greth tilted his head, his spine making a series of sickening pops. "What happened? What happened?" His smile widened, cracked lips splitting open further. "I was chosen," he purred. "The wyrdstone, it gives, Alric. It shows you what lies beyond the veil. And I have seen." He took a step forward, his body jerking with unnatural grace. "You have all been so very, very blind," Greth whispered. "Did you ever wonder why the map led you here? Why it guided you into the very heart of Mordheim?" Alric felt something cold settle in his gut. "Explain," he demanded. Greth grinned, his sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. "The map was never real," he hissed. Isolde froze. Greth spread his arms wide, his fingers twitching. "There is no treasure, no great wyrdstone cache. The map was a lure, a whisper, placed in the minds of greedy little warbands, leading them here, to this place, to the heart of the corruption." He took another step forward, his breathing ragged with manic joy. "You didn't come here to take, you came here to give." Ulric's heart pounded in his chest. "Give?" he asked slowly. Greth shuddered, his body convulsing, his hands clawing at the air. "Your souls," he moaned, "your flesh, your pain, your screams. Mordheim feeds, and it needs fresh offerings." He laughed again, his body convulsing, the wyrdstone embedded in his flesh pulsing violently. "And oh, how you have fed it already." Alric's grip tightened on his sword. "You led us here," he growled. Greth's smile widened. "I did." Alric lunged. The escape from the cathedral. His blade flashed, slicing toward Greth's mutated throat, but the alchemist moved faster than any human should, twisting out of the way in a blur of motion. Greth laughed, his limbs bending at unnatural angles, his nails raking the air as he skittered backward like a spider. "You can't kill me, Captain," he cooed. "I am beyond flesh now." Then the cathedral trembled. The bones on the floor began to stir, shifting, rolling, rattling like dry leaves in a dead wind. From the shadows beyond the ruined pews, something moved. A dozen glowing eyes opened, their green light burning through the gloom. Alric felt his blood turn to ice. Greth sighed in pleasure, stretching his twisted arms. "Aha, there they are!" From the depths of the cathedral things emerged. Not quite human, not quite dead, their bodies swollen with wyrdstone growths, their faces frozen in eternal agony, their limbs too long, their spines broken, but still moving. And they were hungry. "Run!" Isolde hissed. Alric did not hesitate. They turned and bolted for the cathedral doors, their boots slamming against bone and dust, the things shrieking behind them, their clawed hands grasping at the air. Greth's laughter echoed through the ruins, his voice distorted and inhuman. "Run, little sheep," he called, "but the city never lets you leave." Alric and Isolde burst through the cathedral doors, plunging back into the ruins of Mordheim, the sound of screeching horrors pursuing them into the night. The map had been a lie, and now Mordheim was done playing with them. Chapter 13. The Crimson Rose Wilts. The Skaven Swarm. The doors of the Cathedral of Bones exploded inward. A tide of filth and fangs poured through the entrance, Skaven chittering and shrieking, their black-clad assassins skittering along the walls like spiders, blades glinting in the sickly green light of wyrdstone lanterns. Hagen barely had time to scream before the first dagger struck him. The blade sank into his throat, a black, rusted edge coated in green venom. His mouth opened in shock, blood bubbling up his lips as his eyes rolled back in horror. Then another dagger struck, and another. He went down hard, coughing blood, his axe slipping from his fingers. Alric saw him fall but had no time to react. The Skaven assassins leapt into the room, their red eyes gleaming, their robes of ragged black cloth swirling around their twitching limbs. The warband had nowhere to run. Nowhere but down. The desperate escape. Alric slashed Requiem through the first Skaven's gut, spilling its slimy intestines onto the stone floor. Another lunged at him, but Isolde's rapier was already there, punching through its eye socket, twisting, ripping through its skull. "We have to move," she screamed. Wulfgar, bloodied but unwavering, raised his warhammer high and pointed toward the altar. Sigmar guide us. Then, without warning, he slammed his hammer down onto the stone floor. The impact sent a deep, resounding crack through the cathedral, and beneath them, the ground gave way. Alric barely had time to curse before the floor collapsed beneath them, sending them plunging into the darkness below. The catacombs below. They hit the ground hard, tumbling into the damp, rotting tunnels beneath the cathedral. The air was thick with decay, the walls slick with moss and stagnant water, bones jutting from the earthen walls like roots. The remnants of centuries-old tombs lined the corridors, their sarcophagi split open, their occupants long devoured by whatever horrors lurked below Mordheim. Alric groaned, pushing himself up. Wulfgar was already on his feet, clutching his hammer, his breath heavy with fanaticism. "This is it," he murmured. "Sigmar's path." Isolde staggered up, rubbing her wrist. "That wasn't Sigmar," she snapped. "That was you breaking the floor." Above them the chittering grew louder. The Skaven poured into the cathedral above, their screeches of frustration echoing through the ruins. They were searching for another way down, and they would find it. Alric cursed, wiping blood from his mouth. "We move." The depths of madness. The tunnels twisted deeper, the path uneven, strewn with ancient remains. Some skeletons were whole, wrapped in decayed robes of long-dead priests, clutching Sigmarite pendants in skeletal hands. Others were wrong, twisted, warped, bones that had fused together, skulls that had split open from within, rib cages stretched unnaturally, as if something had tried to crawl out from inside the bodies before they died. "The city poisons everything," Isolde muttered, staring at the contorted remains. Wulfgar strode forward, undeterred, his hammer dragging against the stone floor. "This is holy ground," he said. Alric frowned. "Are you still hearing him?" Wulfgar smiled, his teeth bloodied and cracked. "He speaks to me. He guides me." Isolde's fingers twitched over her rapier's hilt, her jaw tightening. "This is a death march," she said. "You're leading us straight into it, priest." "The way forward is blessed," Wulfgar insisted. Alric exhaled sharply. He wasn't sure if Wulfgar's madness would save them or kill them all. The river of the dead. The tunnels opened into a vast underground chamber, where a blackened river cut through the catacombs like a wound. The water was thick and stagnant, its surface covered in floating bones, skulls bobbing like lanterns in the torchlight. A boat rested on the shore, half-rotted but seemingly intact. Wulfgar stepped forward, his eyes glazing with certainty. "This is Sigmar's path," he whispered. "He will carry us through the underworld." Alric felt the cold weight of dread settle in his gut. They had no other choice. Behind them, the tunnels echoed with the sound of clawed feet, of Skaven sniffing out their prey, closing in. Alric tightened his grip on his sword. "Then let's sail," he muttered. They climbed into the rotting vessel, pushing off into the black waters, drifting deeper into the abyss of Mordheim. The Skaven shrieked behind them, but they could not follow. Not yet. As they drifted into the dark, Wulfgar closed his eyes, whispering a prayer to his unseen god. Alric wasn't sure if Sigmar was listening, or if something else was. Chapter 14. The Price of Faith. The River of the Damned. The boat drifted silently down the blackened waterway, its rotted hull creaking under the weight of the warband. The river reeked of decay, its surface oily and thick, littered with floating bones, the remnants of those who had come before and never returned. The air was stale, cold, and beneath it all there was a hum, a deep, low vibration that pressed against the skull, as if the stone around them were alive and whispering. Alric sat at the bow, his grip tight on his sword, his eyes fixed on the tunnel ahead. The cavern walls loomed, slick with moss and filth, the rock veined with the sickly green glow of wyrdstone, pulsing like diseased arteries. Behind him, Isolde watched Wulfgar, her fingers twitching over the hilt of her rapier. The priest sat at the stern, his eyes half-lidded, his lips moving in whispered prayer. Or were they whispers at all? Alric had seen Wulfgar pray 1,000 times, had heard the hymns of Sigmarite zealots since he was a child. But this was different. There was something beneath his voice, something wrong. Isolde leaned close, her breath warm against Alric's ear. "He's lost," she murmured. "We should have killed him back at the cathedral." Alric didn't answer, because a part of him wondered if she was right. The forgotten temple. The river widened, opening into a massive underground chamber, its ceiling lost in the darkness above. Staggering pillars of black stone jutted from the water like the broken teeth of some dead god, and ahead, rising from a platform of crumbling rock, stood the altar. It was not a Sigmarite shrine. It had never been. The monolith loomed before them, carved from obsidian, its surface etched with symbols that twisted the longer one looked at them. Bone adorned its base, fused together in intricate spiraling patterns of unnatural symmetry. At its peak, a grotesque statue loomed, half human, half something else entirely, its limbs stretched and elongated, its face twisted in an eternal scream. Alric felt his stomach turn. This was no place of Sigmar. It was something else, something hungry. The moment of truth. Wulfgar rose slowly, his breath hitching, his body trembling as he stepped forward, his boots splashing in the shallow water. "This is holy ground," he murmured, his voice filled with awe. Alric grabbed his shoulder, yanking him back. "Look at it, Wulfgar. This isn't Sigmar's light. This is something else." Wulfgar turned to him, his milky eyes wide, confusion flickering behind his religious fervor. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, this is the path. Sigmar led us." "Sigmar didn't lead you anywhere," Isolde snapped, stepping beside Alric, her blade glinting in the wyrdstone light. "You've been following something else this whole time, you blind fool." Wulfgar clutched his head, his breath growing erratic. "No, no. That's not possible. Sigmar wouldn't. He wouldn't." Then, the statue moved. The awakening. It was slow at first. A shudder. A creak of bone and sinew, as though something long dead had been roused from slumber. The stone cracked, fissures splitting across the grotesque idol's form, and from within, a wet, glistening mass of flesh began to pulse. Then the whispers began. They came from every direction, from the walls, from the water, from the very air itself. "Welcome, faithful one," Wulfgar gasped, his body going rigid, his head snapping toward the statue. The voice was inside his mind. "You have done well, my child." His breath caught in his throat, his pulse pounding. I don't understand." "You have brought us offerings." And then, from the shadows of the cavern, something crawled forward. The true believers. They slithered from the darkness, their bodies twisted beyond recognition. Once men, their skin stretched thin over bones too long, their eyes black pits, their mouths split open into ragged, drooling grins. Some had no hands, only writhing tendrils of flesh. Others dragged weapons, rusted and caked in old blood, their bodies writhing with pulsating wyrdstone growths. Chaos spawn. Worshippers who had prayed for power and been granted something far worse. Alric raised his sword. "Wulfgar, if you're still in there, we need to run. Now." But Wulfgar just stared at the creatures, his lips trembling, his body shaking with revelation and horror. "No," he whispered. "No, this isn't right." The whispers laughed. "You were never chosen." Wulfgar staggered back, his hammer falling from his grip. Alric didn't wait. "Run!" he roared. The fight in the dark. The Chaos Spawn lunged, shrieking, their malformed limbs reaching for flesh. Alric dodged, his sword flashing, severing a gnarled hand that tried to grasp his throat. The creature hissed, black ichor oozing from the wound, but it didn't stop. Isolde moved like lightning, her rapier finding a gap between ribs, piercing deep into one of the horrors, but the thing simply grabbed the blade with its bare hands, yanking it toward its drooling mouth. She ripped it free, blood spraying in an arc, but the thing kept coming. "To the boat," Alric barked. Wulfgar was still frozen, his eyes locked on the altar, his face contorted in disbelief. The thing inside the idol was still moving, its flesh splitting further, something pushing through, birthing itself into the world. Alric grabbed Wulfgar by the collar, dragging him toward the boat. "Sigma, forgive me," Wulfgar sobbed, his mind shattering under the weight of betrayal. Behind them, the spawns surged forward, their shrieks echoing through the cavern. They leapt into the boat, pushing off just as the creatures reached the shore, their twisted limbs grasping at empty air, their hungry wails reverberating through the tunnels. As they drifted into the dark, Wulfgar collapsed, his face buried in his hands, his body racked with silent sobs. He had given everything to his god, and had been answered by something else. Alric stared at him, his expression hard, unreadable. He wasn't sure if Wulfgar would ever come back from this, or if he wanted him to. Chapter 15. The Dead Rose Blooms Again. The Rotting Tunnel. The boat drifted through the underground river, cutting through inky blackness, its rotting hull groaning under the weight of the survivors. The silence was thick, but it was not empty. The tunnels whispered. The echoes of their escape still clung to the damp air, the screeches of the chaos spawn, the sickly wet sound of tearing flesh, and Wulfgar's broken sobs as the truth of his faith shattered around him. Alric sat at the prow, his grip tight on the hilt of Requiem, his body aching from battle. Opposite him, Isolde leaned against the wooden edge, her breath ragged, her hand pressed against a deep gash along her side. Blood seeped through her fingers. She was wounded, and if they didn't get out of here soon, she would die. He met her gaze, and even in the darkness, even through the pain, she still smirked. "You look like shit," she whispered. Alric exhaled, shaking his head. "You're not much better." She grimaced, shifting her weight. "I've had worse." The boat lurched as the river grew shallow, the tunnel narrowing ahead. The stone walls pressed close, slick with rot and the pale glow of wormstone veins, their sickly light pulsing like diseased arteries beneath the city's flesh. Then ahead, a crumbling archway leading into another open crypt chamber. Alric gritted his teeth. End of the line. The crypt of the Forsaken. They pulled the boat ashore, stepping onto the slimy stone. The air was thick with decay, the scent of rotting flesh and damp stone clogging their lungs. Old burial alcoves lined the walls, filled with the long dead, their bones arranged in macabre displays. Skulls stared from the darkness, their empty sockets filled with wyrdstone glow, as though the city itself had begun wearing the dead like a mask. Alric turned to Wulfgar. The priest stood motionless, his hammer hanging limp at his side, his eyes hollow and empty. He had not spoken since they fled the altar. Isolde sneered, pressing her bloody palm against the crypt wall. "Your god still guiding us, priest?" Wulfgar didn't respond. He was lost in himself, trapped in a faith that had betrayed him, a faith that had never existed in the first place. Alric let out a slow breath. "We need to move." The city's cruel game. The path ahead was a narrow passage carved through the earth and stone leading upward, toward the surface, toward freedom. They moved carefully, Isolde limping, her breath sharp with pain, but she refused to slow down. The deeper they went, the more Alric felt it, the weight of Mordheim pressing against them, its presence thick, suffocating. The city was watching, and it was laughing. Then, a shifting shadow moved in the tunnel ahead. Not Skaven, not chaos spawn. Alric drew his sword. "We're not alone." The shadows thickened, shifting like living things, and then a figure emerged. A man dressed in tattered noble's finery, his face hidden beneath a plague doctor's mask, his hands clutching a staff topped with a wyrdstone shard, its sickly glow illuminating the tunnel. His voice was wrong. It came not from his mouth, but from everywhere at once. "You wander still, lost souls." Alric raised his sword. "Who are you?" The plague-masked man tilted his head. "Who are you, Alric von Kessel?" The voice echoed, slithering into his mind like a parasite burrowing into his skull. Alric staggered, his breath hitching. The world tilted, the walls of the tunnel shifting, morphing. He was no longer in the crypts. He was standing on a battlefield, the cries of the dying surrounding him, the stench of burning flesh filling his nostrils. He saw Isolde bleeding out, reaching for him. He saw Jurgen roaring in defiance moments before the abomination crushed him. He saw Ludolf, impaled, choking on his own blood. And he saw himself, standing before the ruined gates of Mordheim, holding the map that had led them here. This was always the end, Alric. Mordheim is not a city, it is a fate. And it has already chosen yours. The wound that will not heal. Alric gasped, stumbling back into the crypt, his sword shaking in his grip. The plague-masked figure was gone. The tunnel was silent. Only Isolde remained, breathing heavily, clutching her wound, her eyes dark with pain and exhaustion. She studied him, her face unreadable. "You saw it, didn't you?" she murmured. Alric swallowed, his throat dry. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isolde's smile was bitter. "This place is laughing at us," she said, twisting fate like a god playing with insects. She let out a shaky breath, her hands slick with her own blood. "I never trusted Wulfgar," she admitted, "not from the beginning, not even for a second." Alric's chest tightened. "Then why did you follow me?" Isolde exhaled sharply, her gaze locked onto his. "Because it wasn't about the treasure," she murmured. "It was about you." Alric felt his heart stammer. The city whispered around them, its presence thick, all-encompassing, as though it were drinking in their suffering, savoring every last drop. And in that moment, Alric knew they were never meant to leave. Chapter 16. The Unholy Revelations. The desperate ascent. The crypt walls groaned, shifting like a living thing. The air was thick with the scent of blood, dust, and decay, the tunnel closing behind them, as if Mordheim itself were sealing them in. Alric von Kessel pushed forward, gripping Isolde's half-conscious form against him. Her blood was slick on his fingers, leaking through her tattered leathers. She had stopped making jokes. That terrified him more than the horrors lurking in the dark. Wulfgar stumbled behind him, his hammer dragging against the stone, his once zealous mutterings now hollow and broken. His faith was a corpse, its remnants pooling inside him like a dead man's breath. The city was winning, and yet they had nowhere else to go. There was only one path left, toward the heart of the ruin, where the map had led them from the very beginning, the supposed treasure. Even now, Alric wondered if he had ever truly believed in it, if the map had ever been real, if this had always been a trap. The gates of the lost. They emerged from the crypts into a vast ruin, the collapsed husk of some once grand palace, its towering walls split and blackened, the air humming with unseen energy. Ahead, the ground trembled, as if something beneath the earth was breathing. And in the center of it all, a chasm yawned wide, its edges lined with twisted pillars of black stone, wyrdstone veins pulsing beneath its surface, like molten veins of a living god. At the center of the chasm, where the city's ruin converged, there lay the treasure. A wyrdstone deposit, larger than anything Alric had ever seen. It glowed with a sickly green light, tendrils of energy rising from it like mist, twisting the very air, distorting reality itself. The stone was not just a resource, it was alive, pulsating, watching. Alric felt his stomach churn. This wasn't a treasure hoard. This was a wound, a gaping maw in reality, where the world bled into something else. And the closer they got, the more they felt it pulling at them. The price of greed. Wulfgar fell to his knees, his fingers digging into the cracked earth, his breath ragged and wild. "This is it," he murmured, his eyes reflecting the wyrdstone's glow. "This is power." Alric shook his head, gripping the hilt of his sword. "This isn't power," he muttered. "This is a curse." He turned to Isolde. She was struggling to stay upright, her breath shallow, her face pale from blood loss. She managed a weak smile, her fingers curling in his tunic. "You can feel it, can't you?" Alric exhaled sharply. "Feel what?" "The city," she whispered. "It wants us here. We were never meant to leave." A laugh echoed through the ruin. A familiar, wet, gurgling laugh. Alric's blood ran cold. Greth, the false prophet returns. From the shadows of the ruin, a figure emerged, his body half-wreathed in wyrdstone energy, his flesh stretched and mutated, his eyes glowing with unnatural hunger. Greth had returned, or what remained of him. His arms had elongated, his fingers twisted into talons, wyrdstone embedded in his ribcage, the glow pulsing in rhythm with his breath. His face was barely human anymore, the jaw split into a too-wide grin, his teeth jagged and stained black. He looked at them as if they were prey. "You finally made it," he whispered, his voice inhuman, layered like two things speaking at once. Alric tightened his grip on his sword. "Greth," he growled. The thing tilted its head, the bones in its neck cracking like snapping branches. "Not Greth," it purred. "Not anymore." He gestured toward the wyrdstone deposit, the tendrils of light coiling around its mutated fingers. "Do you see it now?" it whispered. "The gift. The truth." Alric felt bile rise in his throat. "This isn't treasure," he said. "It's a damned trap." Greth's laughter was like a dying animal's gurgle. "It's not a trap," he said softly. "It's an invitation." And then the ground split open. The awakening. A wave of force exploded outward from the wyrdstone deposit, a pulse of raw corruption, sending Alric and the others staggering back. The air distorted, the ruin around them shaking, and from the depths of the chasm, something began to rise. It was not flesh. It was not stone. It was something in between. A writhing, shifting mass. Hundreds of twisted faces forming and dissolving, arms growing and unraveling. A thing of wyrdstone and madness. A monument to the city's curse made flesh. It did not roar. It did not speak. It existed, and that was enough. The mere sight of it was wrong, its presence a violation of everything sane and real. And it was hungry. Greth spread his arms wide, his face twisted in rapture. "Behold," he whispered, "Mordheim's true gift." Alric stared at the thing, his mind reeling. There was no fighting this. There was no winning. There was only one choice left. Run. The dead rose wilts. Alric grabbed Isolde, hoisting her onto his shoulder despite her pained protests. "Wulfgar, move!" he bellowed. But the priest did not move. He stood frozen, staring at the rising horror, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His faith was gone. His purpose was shattered. And yet, in the madness of the moment, he found peace. He let go. Before Alric could stop him, Wulfgar stepped toward the chasm, arms outstretched, his voice breaking into a frenzied prayer. "Sigmar," he whispered, "take me home." The thing reached for him, and Wulfgar was gone, swallowed without a sound. Alric staggered back, his heart pounding. Isolde let out a ragged breath, her voice weak. "He was right about one thing," she muttered. Alric glanced down at her. "What's that?" She looked up at him, her eyes dark, unreadable. "We were always meant to die here." Then the ruin collapsed, the ground splitting open, the sky above flashing with wyrdstone fire. And Alric ran into the dark, dragging Isolde with him. The Crimson Rose was dead, and Mordheim wasn't finished with them yet. Chapter 17. The Temptation of Chaos. The shattered path. Alric ran. The world collapsed around them, the ruins of Mordheim tearing themselves apart, as if the city itself had had enough of the game and was now swallowing its pieces whole. The ground heaved and split, great jagged fractures of wyrdstone erupting like tumors, spewing forth sickly green light that seared the air. Isolde was a dead weight in his arms, barely conscious, her breath shallow, her blood leaving a trail behind them. Behind them, the thing in the chasm was still rising, a grotesque monument of flesh and stone, its endless mouths forming and dissolving, spewing forth whispers that crawled into the marrow of the mind. "Do not run. It can all be yours. Stay. Take the gift." Alric gritted his teeth, forcing himself not to listen. But the words were already inside him. The choice. They stumbled into a half-collapsed ruin, one of the many crumbling estates that had once belonged to Mordheim's noble families. Torn banners still hung from the shattered ceiling, their sigils long since unrecognizable, rotted and burned by the passage of time. Alric set Isolde down, pressing a hand against her wound. She groaned, eyes fluttering open, her breath hitching in pain. "Still alive," she muttered, smirking weakly. "It's a shame." Alric exhaled sharply, gripping his sword so tightly his knuckles went white. They were at the edge of the abyss now. There was only one way out. If they pushed forward, if they left everything behind, they could still escape with their lives. But if they turned back, if they took the wyrdstone, if they claimed the treasure they had come for, they would never leave the same. And that was assuming they left at all. The call of the stone. Alric had spent his whole life chasing something. Gold. Glory. A legacy. He had buried friends, lovers, comrades for less than what lay behind him now. A wyrdstone deposit large enough to buy a kingdom. Even now he could feel its pull. It was more than wealth. It was power. It was potential. You could be more. The thought was not his own, but it felt like it was. You have bled. You have sacrificed. And now, here, at the end of all things, you can take what is rightfully yours. His hands shook. His feet refused to move forward. He remembered Greth's face, twisted and inhuman, his eyes filled with worship and madness. He remembered Wulfgar's broken sobs as he realized his faith had been a lie. He remembered Jurgen, standing against the abomination, knowing full well he would never walk away. And now here he was, the last survivor of a dying warband, standing at the threshold of damnation and destiny. And he did not know which was worse. Wulfgar's final fate. A low, wet laugh echoed from the darkness. Alric spun, his heart hammering. A figure limped from the shadows, hunched and dragging something heavy behind it. It was Wulfgar, but he was no longer a man. The priest's once proud frame had withered, his flesh stretched thin, his veins dark and pulsing with wyrdstone glow. His robes hung in tatters, the once sacred sigil of Sigmar stained black with corruption. His eyes, once milky white with faith, were now bottomless pits, twin abysses of madness and revelation. And behind him, dragging like a broken limb, was his warhammer. Its once gleaming head had fractured, its runes blackened, as if the weapon itself had recoiled from its master's fate. He smiled. "Sigmar spoke to me," Wulfgar whispered, "but it was not him." Alric felt cold dread coil around his heart. "Wulfgar," he murmured, "what have you done?" The priest took another step forward, his body shaking violently, as if he were barely holding himself together. "It wanted me," Wulfgar said, his voice a soft, almost childlike murmur. "It needed me to open the door." Isolde tried to push herself up, but the pain was too much. "You fool," she rasped. Wulfgar laughed. "Fool." He tilted his head, his face twitching, his grin splitting his lips too wide. "You think this was ever about us?" Alric tensed, his fingers twitching toward his sword. Wulfgar watched him, his eyes gleaming with something alien. "We were never meant to leave," he murmured. "We were meant to become." The breaking point. The ground trembled beneath them. The wyrdstone deposit pulsed, sending ripples through the ruin, the air thick with heat and voices. Wulfgar shuddered, his body convulsing, his fingers twitching like a marionette on tangled strings. He took one final step toward the abyss. "I will not fight it any more," he whispered. Then he let go. His warhammer slipped from his grasp, clattering against the broken stone floor. And then, with a final shuddering breath, he stepped backward, into the chasm. The light swallowed him whole. There was no scream, no impact, just silence. Then the chasm pulsed, and a new voice joined the whispers. Alric stared at the empty space where Wulfgar had stood, his fingers tightening into fists. Isolde let out a weak, bitter laugh. "That's it, then," she murmured. "No treasure, no glory, just fools and bones." She looked up at him, her eyes hollow but defiant. "So what's it going to be, Captain?" she whispered. "Do we take the stone, or do we die like the rest?" Alric looked at the glowing wyrdstone, its light crawling over his skin, whispering, begging, promising. He took a deep breath and made his choice. Chapter 18. Isolde's Sacrifice. The Awakening of the Profane. The chasm pulsed, its wyrdstone veins beating like a massive, sickly heart, and from its depths, something stirred. Wulfgar had fallen, swallowed by the gaping maw of Mordheim, but the city was not done with him. The air grew thick, heavy with the stench of burning flesh and rotting souls. And then, a low, gurgling voice echoed from the abyss. "You cannot run." A hand, twisted, elongated, its flesh stretched too tight over bulging wyrdstone veins, clawed its way over the chasm's edge. Then another. With a grotesque, bone-cracking heave, the thing that had once been Wulfgar pulled itself from the abyss. It was not a man anymore. His once proud Sigmarite armor had fused into his mutated flesh, warped and blackened by chaos, his ribs jutting out like jagged spikes, his face half consumed by a writhing mass of wyrdstone tumors. His eyes were gone, replaced by twin pits of churning green fire, his mouth twisted into a jagged, inhuman grin. And from his twisted back, blackened, skeletal wings unfurled, their edges tattered and burned, as if the gods had mocked his faith and given him the mockery of an angel's form. He rose, standing 7 feet tall, his breath ragged and unnatural, his hammer now a melted, fused appendage, twisted into his arm, dripping wyrdstone-infused ichor. Faithless, weak, you should have embraced it. Alric stumbled back, his blood turning to ice. "Sigmar, help us," Isolde whispered. The thing that had been Wulfgar turned its burning gaze upon her. "Sigmar is dead." And then he attacked. The final battle. The ruin exploded into chaos. Wulfgar lunged, his mutated form blurring with unnatural speed, his hammer fist swinging with inhuman force. Alric barely dodged, throwing himself aside as the ground where he had stood shattered, sending shards of wyrdstone and stone flying in all directions. Isolde rolled under the blow, coming up fast, her rapier flashing in the sickly light. She struck. Her blade sank deep into Wulfgar's side, piercing between his ribs, but instead of blood, a thick, black ichor erupted, sizzling as it hit the ground. Wulfgar laughed, the sound inhuman, layered, wrong. "That tickle, little rose." He backhanded her with monstrous strength. The blow sent her flying, her body slamming into the remains of a broken pillar, bones snapping on impact. "Isolde!" Alric roared. But there was no time. Wulfgar was already turning toward him, his jaws parting, his breath reeking of corruption and death. Alric raised his sword, his legs bracing for one final stand. Then Isolde moved. The sacrifice. She was dying. She knew it. Her left arm hung uselessly, shattered from the impact, her ribs cracked, her breath shallow, but her legs still worked. And that was enough. She grinned, spitting blood onto the wyrdstone-laced ground. "Hey, Wulfgar," she coughed, gripping her rapier in her one good hand. The thing turned. Isolde darted forward, moving like a phantom, her blade a flicker of silver in the gloom. She didn't aim for his chest. She didn't aim for his neck. She drove the blade straight into his glowing, pulsing wyrdstone heart. Wulfgar screamed, not in pain, in rage, in fury that something as small and insignificant as her had dared to defy him. His clawed fingers seized her throat, lifting her off the ground, his face twisted in hatred and betrayal. "You are nothing," he snarled. Isolde's lips curled into a bloody smile. "But I'll still die laughing at you, priest." And with one last, brutal motion, she wrenched the blade deeper. The wyrdstone shattered, its energy erupting outward. For the first time, Wulfgar screamed in agony. His body convulsed, his form unstable, his flesh melting and reforming, his twisted wings writhing as the wyrdstone turned on him. Isolde's body went limp in his grasp, but her blade held firm, buried in his corrupted heart. Alric knew what came next. And he ran. The collapse. The entire ruin shook, the wyrdstone veins erupting, spewing forth sickly green fire. Alric barely made it out before the ground collapsed, the entire structure imploding, as if Mordheim itself had decided to consume its failed champion. He did not look back. Not when the screams of Wulfgar faded into nothing. Not when the roar of the collapse echoed through the dead city. Not when he knew Isolde had gone with him. He kept running. The ashes of the rose. When Alric finally stopped, he found himself alone. The ruins stretched endlessly around him, the green glow of wyrdstone still flickering like dying embers in the distance. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body aching, bloody, beaten. And for the first time in his life, he felt completely, utterly lost. The crimson roses were gone. Isolde was gone. Jurgen, Hagen, Greth, Wulfgar, all of them dead, swallowed by the city of the damned. And he had nothing left to show for it, except his life. He should have felt lucky, but all he felt was emptiness. He closed his eyes. And then, beneath the ruins of Mordheim, the city whispered one last time, "It's not over." Alric's eyes snapped open. The wyrdstone glow still pulsed beneath the ruins. The city was not done with him, and he was not done with it. Chapter 19. The Last Survivor. The ruins close in. Alric ran. His boots pounded against the shattered streets, kicking up ash and bone dust, his breath coming ragged and uneven, each step a battle against the exhaustion dragging him down. His body ached, his wounds bled, his mind screamed. But none of it mattered, because the city was collapsing, and Mordheim's horrors were closing in. Behind him, the nightmarish skyline of the accursed city twisted, wyrdstone veins pulsing brighter, their sickly green glow illuminating the ruin like a funeral pyre. The sky itself seemed to split, shadowed figures writhing in the unnatural glow, their voices a chorus of whispers and screams. Mordheim was dying, and it would not let him leave alive. The gauntlet of the damned. Alric tore through the ruined streets, his breath raw, his legs burning. And then, from the shadows of the collapsed buildings, they came. First, the Skaven, their red eyes gleaming, their clawed hands gripping rusted blades, tails whipping against the broken stone. They hissed and shrieked, their bodies swarming from sewer grates and ruined alleyways, their voices a chittering storm of hunger and malice. "Man-thing flees, kill, kill!" A spear lashed toward him. Alric twisted, the rusted tip scraping his ribs, searing pain tearing through his side. He roared, slamming his boot into the Skaven's knee, sending it crashing into the ground before driving his sword through its hunched back. The rat screamed, its body convulsing, its blood boiling from wyrdstone corruption. More poured from the ruins, their weapons gleaming, their jaws snapping with hunger. Alric ran harder. The Chaos Mutants? The streets turned against him, the ground splitting open, buildings groaning as they collapsed inward, forcing him into the remnants of a noble district, where twisted mansions stood like rotting corpses. And from within the ruins, something else emerged. One's men. Chaos mutants, their bodies warped by the city's curse, their limbs too long, their faces stretched into grotesque mockeries of humanity. One had 6 arms, each gripping a different rusted weapon. Another dragged itself forward, its spine twisted into a jagged, unnatural arch, its mouth stretched too wide, rows of teeth grinding together in a wet, rasping hiss. They smelled his blood, and they wanted it. The first leapt, swinging 2 cleavers in a wild arc. Alric ducked, the blades missing by inches, then drove his sword into the thing's gut, only for its 6th arm to grip his wrist, squeezing with inhuman strength. He snarled, ripping his arm free, the mutant's bone-like fingers snapping off in the process, black ichor spraying onto his armor. Another mutant lunged, twin mouths gnashing, and he rolled beneath it, hacking off its leg at the knee, sending it crashing to the ground in a flailing, shrieking mess. But there were too many. For every one he cut down, another took its place, their jagged claws reaching, their warped bodies blocking every exit. Then the bell tolled, a low, thunderous sound, deep and resonant, shaking the very bones of the city. Mordheim was calling its children home. And the horrors answered. The great bridge. Alric broke free, sprinting through the twisting alleys, dodging falling debris and twisted corpses that shuddered as if trying to rise. Then he saw it. The bridge. The great stone expanse that once connected Mordheim to the outside world, its massive Sigmarite statues cracked but still standing, their blind eyes watching him flee. He nearly collapsed at the sight of it. It was his only way out. The final path to freedom. And then he saw the truth. The bridge was gone. Its center had collapsed, a massive chasm splitting it in two, the remains of stonework crumbling into the abyss below, swallowed by Mordheim's endless hunger. Alric staggered to a halt, his breath ragged, his vision swimming with exhaustion. No, he breathed. It was over. There was no way out. The last stand. The Skaven emerged from the streets behind him, their blades gleaming, their fangs bared. The mutants stalked forward, their warped bodies trembling with anticipation. And above them, something else loomed, a shadow too vast, too terrible to be real, its presence warping the very air, its form shifting and undulating like a living nightmare. Mordheim's final horror. Alric stood at the edge of the broken bridge, his sword slick with blood, his lungs burning, his legs trembling. He had fought. He had bled. And for what? To die here, alone, forgotten? Was this always his fate? The Skaven shrieked, the first of them lunging forward. Alric raised his sword, his body bracing for the end. Then, a voice, a whisper. It's not over. A gust of wind howled through the ruins, carrying the echo of something familiar. Alric's eyes widened. Isolde's voice. But she was dead. Wasn't she? A single path remained. A final gamble. Alric took one last breath and jumped into the abyss. Chapter 20. The Fate of the Rose. The Fall into Darkness. Alric plunged into the abyss. The wind howled past him, carrying the screams of the dying, the echoes of lost souls still trapped in Mordheim's endless hunger. He tumbled through the void, his body weightless, his mind drowning in a sea of whispers. You cannot leave. You were never meant to. You are already ours. He hit something solid, but it was not stone. It was flesh. The ground beneath him writhed, shifting like a mass of pulsing muscle, throbbing in rhythm with the wyrdstone veins that lined the cavern walls. Alric groaned, struggling to push himself up. His bones ached, his body felt shattered, but somehow he was still alive. Or was he? The air was thick with the scent of burning decay, the walls pulsing with a sickly green glow, casting grotesque shadows of things that did not move, but breathed. Above him, far beyond the ruined skyline, the first pale fingers of dawn touched Mordheim. But no light could banish the darkness here. No warmth could reach this far down. He had escaped nothing. The price of the crimson rose. Alric laughed. A weak, bitter sound, swallowed almost immediately by the humming pulse of the cavern walls. He pressed a bloody hand to his forehead, staring up at the ruined ceiling, at the fractured remains of the city above him. There was never a way out, he whispered. He had bled for this city. He had lost his warband, his friends, his second-in-command, his soul. And for what? There had never been a treasure. There had never been a path to glory. Just lies, whispered on wyrdstone winds, leading fools into the same doomed fate, over and over again. The Crimson Rose was dead. The name meant nothing now. He was nothing now, and Mordheim had won. The shadows taken. The shadows moved. Not just the flickering shapes cast by the wyrdstone glow, but something deeper, something that slithered and curled around him, sinking into his skin, his bones, his mind. His body seized, his breath hitching, his vision warping. It was inside him now. It had always been inside him. He could feel the weight of it, the whispers, the pull, the invitation to let go, to become something else. Something new, something Mordheim would keep. Alric gasped, his fingers clawing at his own skin, his mind tearing apart at the seams. This was it. This was how it ended. There was no escape. There was only the city, the next fools. Far above him, beyond the collapsed bridges and ruined towers, beyond the ashen skyline, a new sound echoed across the dead city. The sound of footsteps, the sound of laughter, the sound of mercenaries, armored and eager, stepping into Mordheim for the first time. They say there's a vault of wyrdstone hidden in the ruins of the great palace. You believe that? What do you think, someone else got to it first? A pause. Then another laugh. Then where are they now? The city watched. The wyrdstone pulsed, and Mordheim welcomed its new guests. The cycle began again, and far beneath their feet, in the cavern of the damned, where the last survivor of the Crimson Rose shuddered as the darkness took him, Alric von Kessel laughed, one last time.